I'm Bruce Adolphe here with our first installment of Inside Chamber Music Plus, a short introduction to our archived videos of my lectures, followed by a complete performance of the work under discussion. We're beginning with Benjamin Britten. And you know, it's very fitting to start with Britten because we've all been through something unusual, and it's ongoing, this pandemic where we're isolated from each other in a new way, and we have a sense of loneliness and disconnection that is different for all of us. And Benjamin Britten's music speaks to that kind of situation. As you'll see in my lecture, I explore that concept and the lectures from 5 years ago, because Britten, as a gay man when it was illegal in England, and as a pacifist during extremely nationalistic times, felt isolated from his society. But more importantly, he found a vocabulary in his music to describe that sense of isolation and distance and loneliness. He said, "It is cruel, you know, that music can be so beautiful. It has the beauty of pain, of loneliness, of strength, and of freedom." I watched the lecture and I noticed there was a passage where I didn't fully explain something, and that's what I'm going to look at in this brief moment. It's kind of an opportunity to address something that I simply touched upon briefly. But what it really is this moment in this slow movement where the sense of loneliness and pain is clear in this isolated melody that's separated from the key that surrounds it. And then the loneliness and pain gains strength through increased harmonic sense of community. And then it resolves in a kind of freedom where the dissonant note of the melody is resolved into the community around it of harmony. So here's that spot. It begins with two notes that seem to say B flat major. And the scale in the tune at first seems to fit. Then there's a note, well, that's at least in E flat, it still could fit. But instead of resolving here, it moves to an E natural. Now that E natural is isolated from B flat. It's distant, it's far. It moves through the key of D minor, which doesn't fit either. It tries to come back, but you notice this is unyielding here. And the intervals get larger. A fourth, a fifth searching, a sixth, and now we are in E major up here and B flat major down here. It doesn't resolve at first into E major. Maybe it won't. We don't know what's going to happen. So he revisits this phrase a moment later with more rich harmony, but still, when he gets to the first dissonant note, he harmonizes it completely differently. It's a dissonant harmony, but it's one that Beethoven knew could have resolved here. It suggests C minor, and we will get to C minor, but he starts over. And then we get another dissonant harmony on the same A flat. Now this is not a harmony Beethoven knew, but it is a harmony that exists in the Lydian mode, where you raise the fourth degree of the scale. So there's a hint that maybe the dissonant note can exist comfortably and acceptably and be embraced by Lydian. He starts again. And resolves a completely traditional way to give us that E natural that was so dissonant here in a C major chord, which is the major Picardy third resolution of C minor. So remember, there was this chord that Beethoven knew in C minor? Well, here it resolves. Now, at the very end of this movement, we get two final chords before the resolution. The two dissonant chords are this and this. Now, the first one also has this in the bass. So it's a B flat major chord with the E. That's the problem. B flat major with the E, but it's also a Lydian chord. And then A major with the G sharp, and that G sharp is hanging over from when we had this Lydian chord. And then it resolves to B flat. Now, Lydian is Benjamin Britten's beautiful but also conservative aesthetically solution to the problem of an outside note that is a misfit, that is an outlier, that is dissonant, how to get it to fit into the society of B flat major. If the E becomes part of a Lydian harmony, it belongs. If the G sharp becomes part of a D major harmony, it belongs. And this is given further affirmation in the final movement of the piece, where we end with this. D major, but with G sharps. That's the same chord. That's the Lydian chord. So as you'll see in my lecture, in a more complete way, that Benjamin Britten's vocabulary speaks to loneliness and isolation, pain, but also strength and freedom. Enjoy the lecture and the performance. Technique, the composer's language and technique, when it works, it comes from the person's life, really who they are, and a fortuitous, usually, education. So for example, in the case of Fauré, we had, if you remember, and if you don't, I'm going to tell you now, but shorter. We had someone who learned from age 11 to 20, remember in the Niedermeyer school, a particular kind of harmony, a harmony different from what was taught before, and is actually different from what is taught now, in which instead of modulating from keys, it moved through keys in a kind of open chromatic way, which fit his lifestyle, which was promiscuous. In other words, he learned how to move from key to key and flirt with keys and never land in them unless he felt like it, which is exactly how he lived his life. And in fact, later on in Fauré's life, when he had a mistress that he established in a separate place from his wife, but they had them both going, that was very much like secondary dominance, is what we call it in music. But he did learn a particular technique, and it fit who he was, which is why his music spoke sincerely. Now, Ravel, who denied sincerity, actually also fits the scenario perfectly well, because Ravel grew up, as you remember, with an engineering, inventing father, and so he grew up with design, meaning not so much about music, but more about mechanics, about how things fit together, how they work. And so toys, cars, wind-up toys in particular, these things informed his sense of technique. So even if he didn't think he was writing about his personal life, he was writing about his childhood. He was writing about what fascinated him, and it fit perfectly with his idea of technique. Then Bartók, who wanted to be Hungarian and not German, as Ravel and Fauré wanted to be French and not German composers, that is. They wanted the music to break away from the hegemony of German music. And this was before hedge funds, so I had to do it differently. Ooh, that was terrible. Okay, that was uncensored, not premeditated. So basically, Bartók defined his language by folk music, and also by his desire to do what Schoenberg did, which is use the total chromatic spectrum, to use all 12 notes continually, but not to use them the way Schoenberg did. And so he invented, yes, exactly, polymodal chromaticism. You remember that word, those two words. Yes, the multi-modes, the different modes linking together, such as Lydian and Phrygian starting on the same tone, giving you therefore the complete chromatic spectrum. Well, Benjamin Britten, it's very similar, and in some ways, a very modern story. He's closer to our time by quite a bit. Died in 1976, and he was only 63. Britten did not want to write in an atonal style. He found it bewildering. He thought it distanced audiences, and he wanted to communicate in a particular way. He felt it was unfriendly, and it didn't appeal to him. He also didn't like abstract art, believe it or not. He thought it was decorative no matter what. He liked the subject matter, like tonality. And he said, he compared them. He said that in painting, the distance or the distortion of the subject from different angles is similar to how you move away and come back to a key. That's how he felt about it. But he needed to find his own way of doing this. And he also had a luck in finding a teacher, like Fauré at the Niedermeyer School. He found a teacher, Frank Bridge, who opened up a world of ideas to him that fit who he was perfectly, and it actually fit him better than these ideas, which we'll get into, fit Frank Bridge. And so Britten was able to create a world of harmony, a world of tonality, and by extension, you'll see bitonality and a whole series of techniques which spoke of who he was. Now, I'm going to read a quote of Britten, which is really important for understanding him. He says, "It is only those who accept their loneliness and refuse all the refuges, whether of tribal nationalism or airtight intellectual systems, who will carry on the human heritage." It exactly sums up who he was and what he believed. Airtight intellectual systems is a dig at Schoenberg and any composer who has a system or method. Although, to be completely fair, Britten did use it a little bit, just a little, but it never sounded like a system. And the other reference, tribal nationalism, is obviously to Bartók and also, believe it or not, even more to Vaughan Williams, because Vaughan Williams' sense of folk music was very displeasing to Britten. He found it uneducated sounding, and he really didn't like it. In fact, he was upset that Vaughan Williams' Fourth Symphony was good. But he said that he heard Vaughan Williams in the audience say of his own music, "If that's modern music, I don't like it," which is very bizarre. But back to Britten. Before we go any further, I want you to hear the opening of this quartet. He wrote this, he was very young. He was 27 to 8. He was living in, at the time, America. He had followed Auden, W.H. Auden, and taken with him Peter Pears. They had just met. And of course, they spent their whole lives together and created, both performance and writing together, a huge body of work. They were here in America, and for a while, Britten was living in a house with Auden, Carson McCullers, and Gypsy Rose Lee. And Pears. And they hated it, because Britten and Pears, although they were thought of in a particular way, the fact is they were such clean gentlemen, and they were always bathing and wearing fresh clothes, and apparently Auden didn't bathe, and Gypsy Rose Lee and Carson McCullers were not interesting to them at all. All right, so let's hear the opening of this, and I want you to think about the Bartók and see if it makes any connections to you. Here's the opening. That's the opening, which is quite beautiful. It's very specific. One of the assignments that when I teach composition I sometimes give is to take one chord and give it a fresh sound. Now, this is a great example of a kind of vision of a harmony, because all you have there is, in the violins, you could call that a cluster. Do you want to just play a Bartók cluster for us for a moment from last week? Okay, that's Bartók clusters. They're kind of violent. This cluster, which is whole tones, because it's very, very, very high, and because it also says molto vibrato, it's shimmering, and it's at a great distance from the cello. It also is tonal. It's not an atonal cluster, because with the cello's notes, we don't have the note A, but if we did, we would have this, a ninth chord. But even without it, it suggests the ninth chord, and then we get a kind of dominant chord. I say kind of because there's a G sharp. If it were G natural, it would be your standard dominant. So it's kind of bittersweet. It's very angelic. But the main thing about this is that it's very Britten, and he uses this kind of thing in many of his works, and I'll say what I mean by this kind of thing. Something that hovers, something that is at a distance and is suspended and hardly moves, versus an individual voice that feels isolated and speaks maybe an operatic recitative. This happens in almost everything he writes at some point. Now, he talked about his loneliness, and he was really lonely for two reasons, primarily. One was he was gay at a time when it was illegal. And so even though he didn't really hide it, he was ostracized to a certain extent, but also accepted, because that was the way the society was. But in England, homosexuality became legal in 1967, when he was 54. So here he was in the public eye with this sense of loneliness, but he also felt that kind of loneliness most of his life, even before, when he was very young, even as a child. But on top of that, he was a pacifist, as was Peter Pears, and as was Auden, at a time when, in the late 30s and into the 40s, into World War II, when, of course, they were actually attacked in the press in England, all the pacifists, but even in particular, Auden and Britten, as being un-British, as being bad patriots. So he had two levels of isolation, which stayed with him. And the themes that developed in his operas, which you can hear even in his chamber music, even before I think he was fully conscious of it, which he certainly was when he wrote the operas, because the texts and the stories are there. But the themes are of isolation from a large group, of being a misfit, of being misunderstood, of being a scapegoat. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier, like the promiscuity of Fauré and the machines of Ravel. This fits the language that he learned musically. So in other words, one of the things that made him be able to be a great composer is that who he was meshed with what he learned and what he had technique for. Now, one of the things he learned is bitonality. Now, bitonality is a very simple concept, but it can be incredibly trivial and silly, or it can be profound. And in Britten's music, it's profound. So bitonality simply means, what do you think? Two or more keys. It can be polytonality. But for example, the simplest way to think of it is, here's silly. If I accompany it, I'm in two keys at the same time. It's the correct harmonies, but the wrong key. I could do this all day. No, I won't. But before we get back to the quartet, I would like you to hear a great example, and probably a perfect example, of bitonality meaning something very specific with words in Britten. This is so clear. And it's from the opera Peter Grimes, which he wrote very shortly after this quartet. He came back, he was inspired, and he found the story of Grimes, and back in England wrote the opera, his first opera, and which turned him into a great star. So here's a section, I'll read you the text first. It's unaccompanied, which makes it very bizarre. There's an orchestra sitting in the pit, but they don't play during this. And Peter Grimes, if you don't know the story, it's Peter Grimes is a man accused of killing these young boys by accident, perhaps, or they don't know how. The investigations are complicated. He's certainly an outcast, and he takes them fishing, and they die. They're accidents. But we don't really learn very much about that. The town basically wants to lynch him, but he's maybe innocent, and there's a woman, Ellen, who understands and loves him. And this duet is Grimes and Ellen right at the beginning of the opera. She is singing in E major. E major represents here purity and love and safe haven. But we have no harmony. She sings, for example, you'll hear it in the opera in a moment. And he is in F minor, which is a dark key, and he sings, for example, the D natural is available in F minor, if not unusual. And they join together finally on this E. And then they sing in E major. He joins her. And what connects F minor and E major in particular is this note. Here's F minor. Here's E major. So she is pulling him towards her with an enharmonic tone. Doesn't it sound less romantic if you give it the technical term? But an enharmonic tone is a pitch that has two spellings, at least on the piano. And on the violin or a string instrument, it has actually slightly different fingerings, but you don't actually think about it too much. You just play in tune, right? Yeah, right, exactly. Which is why it's hard to play with a piano, wouldn't you say? Kind of. Get used to it. There are other reasons, I know. So, but anyway, the G sharp and the A flat are the same key on the piano, and they are the link. Now, let's hear this passage where you don't need to understand every word in case you don't. You might. But this is not Peter Pears. This is Philip Langridge. And because of the way iTunes is, the name of the soprano has, I think, fallen off the... But it may well be Felicity Lott. I believe that it is. Okay, here we go. That actually was something else that turned on from the opera, unconnected. It's an extraordinary thing, and I'm going to play one more bit of Peter Grimes for you, which also relates to this opening. It is the most extreme example, I think, in all of Britain, of this idea of a hovering pedal, you might call it, or a drone, which is a word that doesn't mean what it used to mean anymore, but a drone used to in music mean something that stayed there, you know, like bagpipe drone, if it's a folk music concept, a pedal point and an organ point. So at the end of Peter Grimes, there's a manhunt, and the town sings his name many times, usually in major chords. Why major chords if they're coming to get someone? Probably because they feel good about themselves, and they know they're doing the right thing. So it's actually a very creepy major chord, because they're coming in mass kind of manhunt violence, but major. It's very effective. If it were minor, it would be more threatening, but it wouldn't represent what's happening accurately. So he had a great sense of realism. So then you have this major chord, and Grimes, most of the time, is singing in a different key for obvious reasons. He's a misfit, he's isolated, he's being hunted. And he also is going mad at this point. So let me find this moment for you. Okay, but I'm going to move towards the end of it. Now there, it's very chilling. The last thing they sang was not a major chord, it was a fifth. It left out the middle chord, the middle tone. So instead of being major or minor, it was just this, open fifth, but he is in a different area of tonality. He's here. And they're still, and you know, it's dissonant, but it is so clear what it means that it's different from a kind of atonality where everything is dissonant, which is what he didn't like about atonality. He felt that bitonality offered him metaphor. It offered him absolutely clear meaning in which he can put a narrative. His teacher, Frank Bridge, wrote a lot of bitonal music, and it was actually so famous for it for a while that there is a chord called the bridge chord, which is this. There are actually two versions of it. It's this, but I'll separate it, or I'll make it more resonant. It's a C minor chord, and then above it, a D major chord. Now, I have to quibble with this a little bit. I hope you don't mind. Can I quibble? Yeah. They call this bitonal. But actually, those two chords exist in G minor together. Theorists drive me crazy. So, in fact, you know, if you are in G minor, there it is. It's actually a prolongation. It's not two keys. It's a prolongation of one chord while the other one lands on top of it. But he also writes this chord a lot. This is the other bridge chord, which is if you take C major and C sharp minor, you get this. which also sounds like this, or this, depending how you do it. And in Bridges' piano sonata, you hear quite a lot of the first chord like this. That's D minor with E major. I have to de-quibble slightly. It does sound like it's not one key because you never hear the functions of the key. So the term bitonal, it helps you understand it. It's not 100% perfect, but it's okay. It's really just bichordal, which is different than bicoastal. Okay. Now, if we could look at the opening of the third movement of the Bartók for a moment. I want to compare the third movement of the Bartók opening to the Britten for a moment. You heard the Bartók last week, but we didn't touch on the third movement. The opening has something in it that might have also spoken to Britten, who, even though he said in that speech I quoted that he was against folk music, he loved Bartók's music. So, there you go. All right, that's actually enough already. There we have not a high cluster, but a gradually unfolding total cluster of all the notes except one, all the notes of a major key except one. And the one that's missing, cello comes in and plays it, and the cello is isolated from them for quite a few bars. So there is the same kind of thing. And was Bartók ever lonely? Well, who isn't? I didn't mean to say that Britten was always and only the only lonely composer. But that sound of the total chromatic, I mean the total diatonic spectrum. Now by diatonic, I mean all the notes of a major scale. Not all the chromatic notes, that's every note. Just the major scale. That's what they played. They were in A major, and they basically played everything. And then the cello comes in, because they didn't play the D. And the cello goes D sharp and D natural both, because he couldn't make up his mind. Here's the opening gesture of the turn of the screw. This is a piano solo, but it's from the Britten opera, The Turn of the Screw. The pedal is supposed to be down, and this is what you hear. It's a big cluster, but if you take the pedal off, which he doesn't want you to, well, actually, he does want you to do it at the very end, which I didn't do, like this. Just for a moment, like the smoke clears. That is also, just like the Bartók, a total chromatics, I mean a total diatonic spectrum, all the notes of the scale. Does this mean something to Britten and Bartók? It has to. And if you're going to have isolation and a misfit and someone who's alone or misunderstood, then you need everybody else. You need everybody. And so that kind of total cluster really does say that quite beautifully. Now, let's just play the last 2 or 3 measures where the cello hits the low C of the opening. We're going to see, now we're going to go on into the next section, finally. Yes, that C in the cello, and this is typical of Britten, is both very strange and completely ordinary at the same time, which is wonderful. And why is it ordinary? Strange, you can probably tell, because we have the clusters, and then he goes, well, if you put that together, it's the 7th of the it makes a dominant 7th. And if it were Bach, it would move right here, dom, di. But what does it do? Let's hear what it does. Okay, great. Yeah, now this is also very Britten. It does sound like a kind of wild playground. You've got a tune that could be very innocent, but it gets sort of corrupted by lots of chromatic notes. The tune, which the first violin plays, if you play it very simply, it's very childlike. But the context of it is almost demonic. It's wild. It's out of control, slightly dangerous. The cello almost never lets go of that low C. And when the cello does let go of it to do something else, somebody else usually has it, and it comes right back anyway. That low C, whatever it is, won't go away. So that high drone that was there all the time becomes the opposite of that. It becomes this throbbing low C that also won't go away. His problems don't go away. Something that is causing the drama to happen stays. Moving along after that, can you play from, we got to hear what happens to the low C and a few other things. Let's start right at before 50, 49, 48, 47. Yeah, 47 is fine. If you could just play your cello part louder than you normally would, just a little bit, because I want to concentrate on some of that. But. Okay, great. Now, before they land on that D, you notice that C is there quite a lot. But let's take the cello out and start, not at the exact same place, but start at 59, 58, 57, 56, 55, 54, the espressivo. Well, not everyone has espressivo. But do you see where that is? 51, 2, 3, 4. No cello. Counting, sorry. Okay, did you expect that? It's just a minor chord and a major chord. Play that again. It's alarming how simple that is. Right, but the cello is totally a misfit. Now, let's hear the cello alone at that same spot. Yeah, everything the cello does is a problem. Let's put that all together and you'll see this is a different way of doing the same thing. Two simple harmonies, again, the three of them against the outsider. It's a very useful technique, musically speaking, because it gives you stability and clarity and drama at the same time, and you can actually hear it. And the more you listen to it, the easier it is to hear it. Let's hear that all together. Okay, now, starting right here, he does something else which is actually Bartok often does this too. And remember, when Bartok wrote the fourth quartet, Britten was 15 years old. So if you find connections, it's definitely Bartok first. So basically, he divides this next bit of music into three sections. Each section does a similar thing, as you'll be able to hear, which is it gives you one important note, and then everything cascades in a different key away from it. Another important note, and everything cascades in a different key away from it, and another. But each time, a voice of counterpoint is added. So the first time there's one voice skittering away, scampering perhaps. The second time there are two, and the third time there are three, and then it melts back into the opening, which recurs. Let's start right on the D natural 59 and keep going. Two voices. Well, not yet, sorry. Two voices. Three voices. Okay, now it sounds just like the opening, but it's in a different key. It's in F instead of in D. So it's moved up, and of course it will come back. Moving into another key makes this very different, even if you don't have to have perfect pitch, but what happens to it is that it moves up, which is what happens in sonata form. This basically is like a sonata, that the music comes back, but it's been transposed to a level which we call structural dissonance. In other words, it's not the main key. So if you were to be local dissonance would just be like a note leaning on it, or a chord would be a local dissonance. But the whole thing is moved, so it's a structural dissonance. It's like you have to live upstairs for a while, and then you come back downstairs when the painting is done. I don't like that. Okay. So there are, of course, a few other great moments in this. In this F major return, there's a beautiful chord that we don't expect, but I don't think I'll say it. I'll just look like this when it happens. Let's hear, starting at, not right at the tempo, it'll take too long. Let's go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So before 90, 1, 2, 3. Is that okay? Did you hear that? Okay. Yeah, you obviously heard that. It's not necessarily funny, but maybe it is. They arrive at this E-flat area, and they've coalesced into something new. And the cello plays an E natural, which is, again, is it deliberate? What is wrong with you? Is it deliberate? And then it goes back to the C natural, and they don't go along with it. Now, this E-flat was predicted by Britten in this piece earlier on. There's a passage, let's go back to the first one for a moment. If you could play in the opening, bar 13, 14, 15. This is from the first time in D major, but it has moved to F. See, I didn't give you all the details. It has moved to F, and it goes to E flat in a different way. This is the first time. Okay, so it's not an E-flat minor chord like it is later, it's fourths. So he went from D to this F thing to an E-flat, but not, this is called quartal harmony. You can go to the store and get a chord of harmony. Chords by fourths, which was very popular in the early 20th century, and this is already the mid-20th century, so that it just means instead of thirds, it's fourths. So he uses them quite a lot. Hindemith used them a lot, Bartók used them a lot, even Schoenberg used them in particular ways. So what happens, though, back at the second one, is we get this beautiful E-flat minor, very high. And then, just the way the cello played a C, it plays the seventh, only it's a D-flat. And they're together for a while. They agree about this. And then that E natural, which you heard, and then the cello lands on the C again, but the three of them, once again, are together, unified harmonically, unified rhythmically, and the cello is the outsider. Let's hear a little bit of that right at the tempo sostenuto here, where the allegro, you know where I am, right? Tempo secondo allegro. Okay, good. Now, remember Peter Grimes. It's a different mood, it's a different world, it's not as dramatic, it's not as threatening, there are no texts, there's no story. But it is still bitonal, there's still an individual voice that is separated from the rest. It is the same concept, which he uses in multi-levels. Let's just hear the three top voices without the cello for a moment in the same spot. Okay, good. You see how unified they are? It would be hard to be the new kid in school with those three. You know, that's exactly what it feels like. Britten didn't like the school he went to. I know these are broadcasts, so I'm going to tell the truth. The school in Gresham, England, they do wonderful Britten lectures and concerts, and he went there. He hated it when he went there. It's terrible, but now it's fine. But it's interesting how things change. He said there was almost no music at all. The school had no music. All I got to do was play viola in the orchestra. It's amazing to think of. When he played viola, that also was an extra bond with studying with Frank Bridge, who was not only an experienced composer and a pianist like Britten was moving toward being, but was also a violist. And when Britten came to the United States, Bridge said, "Take my viola." And he gave him the bridge that came with it too. No, he said, take my, sorry. Take my viola, and he took his viola. And actually, I don't believe they ever saw each other after that. Okay, moving on to the next thing. Well, we're okay hearing that the cello is an outsider there, I think. The next texture that I want to address is 119. Let's hear, again, this time just the first and second violin for a little while, right at the D major section. Okay, now that's not all that's happening. That's sort of background. But if you could play, you know which spot, in the Bartók Quartet you heard last week, you're going to hear something very similar. Let's just hear the people who play that first, and then we'll put it together. Okay, now how is this similar, you ask? Because they are both playing 3 against 2. One instrument is going da 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 da, and the other one's going dee da dee da dee da da da. So it's a combination bum 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 like that. And that's just play the 3 and then the 2. Okay, it's the viola playing 3. Let's hear the viola again. And the cello. Okay, now let's go back to the Britten where he does the same thing. First violin is playing 3s. It's kind of hard to hear, but it's just meant to be a texture. It's a little easier to hear because they're separated. Bartók has them right on top of each other in a cluster. Britten has them separated, and it's completely tonal. It's completely D major. Then, similarly to the Bartók, which we don't need to hear again, the other 2 instruments have something more important to say than that. Let's hear a little bit of this right there with everybody. Great. Do you recognize the yom bum is that little childlike tune? It appears throughout the piece. It's almost always there, except for in the slow sections. This little childish melody, which it gets put through some scary things. This is also very Britten, that the tunes, not the big arias in the operas, but many tunes are childlike and fun and charming, but they get put through the mill. They get put through a lot of dangerous musical things, if music can be dangerous. It's a great relief and release for him to be able to take these innocent tunes and corrupt them without being arrested. That's sort of what it is. I mean, it feels great. It happens throughout the music, and it is, again, it's not that he only had one idea, or two ideas, or three or four. Every composer has a few great ideas which propel a lot of music. So I'm trying to focus on these. Sometimes they're easier to understand than others, and the more metaphorical they are, the easier it is, obviously, to relate to real life, and this is a really good example of that. Also, he was aware of it, and we know he was aware of it because of the opera texts, which he didn't write, but he commissioned and worked with and collaborated on. And those opera texts, whether it's Turn of the Screw, or Peter Grimes, or Billy Budd, or Death in Venice, they all have the same themes of innocence and corruption and misfit and society. And the music, without a story, still does that. Now, before we get to the end of this movement, the third movement of this, I hesitate to say the rest of my sentence because I'd like you to hear it first, and then I'll say the rest of my sentence. So let's hear up until bar 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then we'll skip to the. I'll stop you. Okay, and actually before we play the next part, can you just play the cluster from the first movement in a different octave? Let's say down one octave. This is the very, very, very high cluster. Let's just put it down for a moment. Very different. Now put it down another octave. Okay, now let's play the first. Let's say the second and third bar of the third movement again. Okay, now maybe you're already hearing what I'm about to say, but it's very, very similar. The first one, if we put it down here, it has on the outside of it just a major third, with a D on the bottom. If you put the D on the top and do this, of another major third, you get this movement. So he doesn't have the cluster, but he does in just a moment. They come in with it. So it's very, very similar, and it's not an accident. I mean, he's deliberately relating something to the first movement. And if you expect there to be an isolated voice who feels like a misfit and an outsider and doesn't fit in with the key, well, let's try that at 1, 2, 3 before 370 or whatever that is. Where it says, you know what I'm talking about. Okay, now, you hang on every note that the violin plays because you don't know where it's going. It is so lost. It is so isolated, and you don't know you don't know what's going to happen or where it's going to go. The keys are not clear, but they're suggested. We have this B flat major, and it starts in B flat major. And then it seems like, oh, it's just going to modulate, but then we're nowhere near it. We're just far away. You know, I've read a lot about what people say about this kind of music, especially the operas. And I think there's something missing that I just want to see if I can articulate for you. It's often said that he is writing about being a misfit, or being homosexual, or being a pacifist, or whatever. And that's what the music's about. Now, I actually think it's the opposite. That's who he is, which allows him to write this music. Do you see what I'm saying? It's different. He's not writing about that. That allows him to find the technique to express something universal through music. It gave him a technique and a vocabulary, not just to tell a personal story, but to take who he was and make it become a musical vocabulary and syntax and a whole set of narrative structures in order to write gorgeous music that meant something. Now, of course, in the operas you have the stories, but still, the stories are never the whole thing in opera. It's the music. And the story allows him to do it, and they are very good stories. But when you have instrumental music, then you have to ask, is the story still there? No, it transcends it. And I think the opera's transcended too, but it's even more obvious that it transcends it in instrumental music. Unlike a lot of opera composers, let's say Verdi, Puccini, or Wagner, people who wrote opera, he also wrote great instrumental music. Verdi has one string quartet. It's great, but he hated it. And he might be right, I don't know. I think it's okay. Wagner, nothing. There's one piece, Siegfried Idyll, one piece. It just sounds like some of his opera, you know. I mean, there's nothing that's not opera, is what I meant. Puccini, no, it's all opera. So, and there are others too. There's a great violin concerto by Britten. There are 3 string quartets that are excellent, and there's other chamber music that are quite beautiful, and there are song cycles that have nothing to do with these stories, where the music still has these qualities. Now, back to the score for a moment. Oh, actually, this reminded me of something in Turn of the Screw. The way the first violin is searching and searching. Probably for Britten, there is an exact meaning for every one of those notes. And I say that because he's really specific when he chooses things. So we feel that. And because there are words in the opera The Turn of the Screw, I found a similar kind of spot where we know exactly why he's choosing the pitches he's choosing. And I will show you. Now, I'm not going to play this operatically for you. I don't happen to have it. And I'm not going to sing it either. Although, no. Okay. So the governess is it's about the governess who has just decided to take a rather daunting job. And the prologue is being sung by a tenor. And he's, for a long time, sings on one note. He sings, she was to do everything, be responsible for everything, not to worry him at all. And then he goes, no, not to write, but to be silent and do her best. It's actually up an octave. But the orchestra does this. She was to do everything. Be responsible for everything, not to worry him at all. No, not to write, but to be silent and do her best. Now, I think it's kind of obvious, but I'll just go over that. This is the most dissonant. It's a tritone. She was to do everything. It's impossible. So he gives you a tritone, which means it's not going to work. Then he says, be responsible. It becomes a major chord. Be responsible for everything. Not to worry becomes a minor chord. And then, to be silent and do her best drops down a pitch, it collapses into resignation. Every single phrase means something, every pitch. And I'm sure that's true all the way through. Okay, so back to the string quartet. You know, there are people who think music doesn't mean anything. Just send them to my house. Okay. Maybe don't, actually. I have some other stuff I have to do. Another spot where the charming tune and the argument against it with the low Cs really comes to a dramatic peak. This would be 140, 1, 2, 3, 4. 144 for a while? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bars or so. So you're hearing the viola and the cello together are playing the open fifths in the low C, and they're quite violent. And the two violins are trying to play that innocent playground tune. Okay, now, this continues, it changes in several ways, but the cello does not let go of the low C. Now, the low C is the lowest note on the cello. It's the lowest open string. I know that Britten loved to write idiomatically. So if he's going to have a low note that is going to be held onto and just going to be relentlessly there, it will be the lowest string. And if there were another string lower, it would be that one. So that the tonal scheme, the design of the tonalities and how they interact are based on the low C string, which is not unusual for composers, but it wouldn't necessarily be something that Schoenberg would consider, or Berg, exactly. In other words, the idiomatic aspect of your whole piece deriving in some way from the way the instruments are made. You know that Britten wanted to study with Alban Berg when he was in school. This is a very strange story. And there was a scholarship available to study abroad. And he applied for it and he got it. And what he wanted to do was study with Berg. But the school never notified him that he could go, and time went on and it just fell apart. And he said to his mother, according to the story, "Whatever happened to my studying with Berg?" And she said, "Oh, well, the school sent us a note and said he would be a bad influence, so we decided against it." That's the whole story. What bad influence they meant was there's something, we don't know, but it's, according to Britten in his reminiscence of this, it sounded like they meant something worse than musical influence. And maybe they did. Who knows? They couldn't have known that the lyric suite was a disguised memoir and diary of an affair, because nobody knew that for many, many, many years. So I don't know what they were thinking of and why that would bother a young student who's trying to learn about music. But what's interesting about it is, what if Benjamin Britten had studied with Berg? What would have happened to his music? Oh, well, we don't know. Okay. Now, one of the strangest things about this movement, and strange is good, right? Isn't it? Yeah. Strange is good. I think I mentioned that the definition of beauty in music by several people, different people over time, is that beauty plus strangeness is romantic, or that beauty needs strangeness to be beautiful. It depends who you look up. But strangeness and beauty go together. Or the more simple way of putting it is that music achieves something great when it has the inevitable and the unexpected. That's sort of the same thing too. It has something you expect and something strange, something wrong. If you take out that something wrong, you get much more ordinary music. And so does this account to a certain extent for why some people find it difficult to listen to either contemporary music or maybe classical music? I'm not sure, but I think there is a disturbing element that you have to hang in there and wait for things to resolve and make sense. You need patience. In Britten, the strange is really obvious, but what's great is that the strange is often clearly isolated from the beautiful in such a way that the dichotomy is clearly what the piece is about. It's not just an aspect of the language, it's what it is. So he could end the piece. Let's do bars 180, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So just before the tempo, before 190, 2 bars, and just stop. This is a possible ending. That would be a gorgeous ending. Here's another possible ending. Let's do the 190, I mean. Like the other one, it's the same chord with the low C on the bottom, unresolved, fading out. It's another possible ending. Let's play the tempo primo, but just 1, 2, 3 bars. That's not so satisfying because there's a G in the viola that makes you want to go on, and it does go on. Let's hear the next little phrase. These endings are really different. He does all of them. One right, just what you just heard them in order, one right after the other, and that's what he does. It's a little odd, but it, like a lot of his music, it makes you hang in there. You can't stop listening. It's a quality of his music that is very powerful, which is he makes decisions, and you hear him making the decisions, and you hang in there. Haydn does that too, but it's very fresh and special. All right, before we hear this entire movement, I want to read a very, very famous poem, and not the whole thing, just part of it, because it relates very strongly to what we were talking about and who Britten was. But you also need to know, before I read it, a little tiny bit of The Turn of the Screw, another passage. I'm just going to play a little bit of this for you. In Turn of the Screw, which is based on the story, there are a male and female adult dead ghosts. Well, they're ghosts. So they were dead earlier. They come back to haunt 2 young children. And the male ghost is haunting the young boy, and the female ghost is haunting the young girl. And it's very dangerous. But more than that, what's really happening is the boy, the governess is trying to save the boy. I won't go into the whole story, but basically the boy dies at the end. And there's a moment where the 2 ghosts are singing together, and they sing over and over, "The ceremony of innocence is drowned," which is a line from Yeats. The ceremony of innocence is drowned. It's the only line, I think, in the entire opera that is not written by the librettist. It's borrowed. It is, again, a symbol of everything we're talking about. Innocence drowned. How does he symbolize it? I'll just give you an idea. In the music, there is a drone. It's an A flat, is always there. But the voices keep singing scales, and those scales are in different keys and different modes. They never stay, they get shifted and changed, and they're never the same. So it is polytonal, polymodal. At the same time, the chords, the A flat is always there, but around it, the chords keep shifting, major, minor, whole tones. They just can't be stable because the center will not hold. The A flat seems to be holding, but everything is tearing it apart. Here's a little bit of that. I might have to slide my finger across this to find the right spot, but whoops. I'm going to move into it a little bit. It's quite chilling, I think. This ceremony of innocence could be, and has been, used as a title of things about Britten. There's a famous ballet called The Ceremony of Innocence, which uses a lot of his music. And the image, not only of the ceremony, but of the center, which is tonality, is called having a tonal center. If it won't hold, everything will fall apart, which is what he didn't want to do. He needed tonality. He needed the center to hold. So I'm going to read the first stanza of The Second Coming of Yeats, which is something obviously Britten knew and cared about. It's actually written about World War I, but here it is, and as a metaphor for tonality and for all kinds of things falling apart. And you can still think of this first paragraph for many things that happen today. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. you.